Hello everyone, Zalo's here, and today we're going to be doing a tutorial on beveling. So we're going to go over what is beveling, the materials needed, a quick demonstration of beveling, and then some tips and best practices. So what is beveling? Beveling is the act of extruding your art on your piece of leather. So after you cut in your design, you use beveling to bring that design out. So some examples here. So here on this design of a raven, we have some beveling here that pulls that design out. Over here, on the edges here, you can see where it's all beveled out to pull the design out on this piece of leather that I tooled. So that is what beveling is. It's just the act of extruding your art to make it 3D. When you are beveling, when you're tooling, you are sculpting the leather. Let's say, okay, so now you are tooling and you want to get into tooling. What materials do you need to start tooling leather and do this beveling? So first you need is a piece of leather, obviously. So I'm going to be using a scrap piece of leather today. Next, you need a swivel knife. So what a swivel knife does is allows you to cut the leather in order to make your bevel. Usually you carve out your design onto the leather and then bevel that cut. So for example, here, this is a swivel knife. This is my swivel knife. I have several. And a word of caution, if you sharpen your own swivel knives, you can over sharpen them. And when you get a razor edge on one of these and you have a thin blade, see this is a thicker blade, but when you have a thin blade, you get a razor cut, and that is a lot harder to bevel. So word of caution there. So you'll need you'll need your swivel knife. Next you'll need a beveling tool. So here is a beveling tool. They come in lots of different sizes and lots of different angles. And then you will need a mallet. There's also several types of different mallets. You can get a rawhide mallet, you can get one of these. I prefer a flat mallet so I can get a good solid hit. And then lastly, something that is a little bit harder to come by, but it's something that I highly recommend, which is a piece of stone. I have here some granite. This is just really solid, so when you tool up your piece and start hammering on it, you have a really good solid hit. So I'm out in my garage. I have this piece of granite on a table with steel legs that go straight to the earth. No wheels. It goes right to the concrete. And that allows me to get a good solid hit. You wouldn't believe the difference it can make if you are on carpet or if you have wheels on your table. The hit is not as good. So with that, we'll get into the process. Okay, here we have our piece of leather, and I'll tell you what the hardest part of this whole thing is, and it's not beveling, it's not carving, it's casing your leather. And what casing your leather is getting it to the right moisture content so that you can get a good bevel, so you can get good carving in it. For me, this is the most mysterious part of leatherworking. Trying to get the moisture level correct is different for every piece of leather. The reason that is because your leather has different thicknesses. This is a very thick piece of leather, so the moisture, getting moisture into it to the right point is going to be different from a thinner piece of leather. The age of the leather matters. The current moisture content of the leather matters. So if this has been stored in such a way that it's not 100% dried out, if it's in a place with high moisture content. One, that's really not great because it has a chance to mold, but the moisture content of your leather is going to be different. So casing your leather is the hardest part to me. We're going to do a technique called quick casing. All that is basically spraying your leather with water, letting it soak up that water, and then judging it to see if it needs more water, and if it does, add more water. Another thing to be cautious about is the type of water you use. I know some people use distilled water. I'm using bottled water, but if you're using water from the tap, things that are like put in your tap, like fluoride or whatever, can affect the staining of the leather as you spray it. So something to be careful about in that regard. If you're using a high-end piece of leather, the type of water you case it with matters. For me, this is a scrap, and this is not the greatest piece of leather, so I don't care that much. Another best practice, but not 100% needed, when you wet your leather, it's wise to wet the entire piece. If you don't, you could get a water stain where it's darker in one part than it is in another part. I've seen people darken, like when they're doing a large piece, they only wet the piece that they're working on, and sometimes that works out fine. And because it can be really annoying to try to wet a very large piece, but if you're working on a smaller piece, I recommend just doing the whole thing. That way, you don't get those water stains. And also, if you're going to be dyeing the leather, those water stains are not going to be as big of a deal, but sometimes the water stain part will be a little bit darker than the not water stain part. Alright, so while we got some moisture in our leather, we're going to cut it. So always make sure you sharpen up your swivel knife. So what I'm going to do here for the example, I'm just going to do a few cuts, straight cuts, maybe a curved cut, so we can do different types of beveling. So if your swivel knife does not cut as smooth as this, just nice smooth cut, probably needs to be sharpened. So on this, the depth of the cut does matter. If you do a really light cut on top with no pressure, that's going to be a lot harder to bevel. Don't recommend doing that. I recommend putting like a medium amount of pressure on there. But it also, greatly depends on how thick your leather is. This is super thick. I can press down pretty hard and I won't cut through the leather. I won't even get to the bottom of it. On thinner leather, you might want to take a piece of it and just practice some cuts and see what depth you really want to get into, right? Okay, so now that we have a few cuts, we'll get to some beveling. So I have several different types of bevelers here. Some have a steeper angle, some are bigger. You can get much bigger than this. If you're beveling a lot of carving, you might want a bigger beveler so that you can cover more ground with it. And what you want to do to get started here, if you have a scrap piece, it might be wise to, if that's from the same cut of leather, to case that piece, that scrap piece at the same time. And if you do that, you can judge that they're about the same moisture content, and you can do some practice hits on that scrap piece to see if it's at the right moisture level. But what you want to do is you want to seat your beveler in that cut. Get it nice and seated. Make sure that you have a good grip on it. And now when you hold it, you want to hold it, you don't want to death grip it. You want to have a kind of a light hit, like a light grip on it, but you want to make sure that you are in control. For your hammer hit, I wouldn't start with a really hard hit. Some people do, and we're gonna say why we don't do that later. But I like to start with a good medium hit, and then once you get it started, you kind of let it bounce and guide itself down the cut. So this leather right now is actually just a little too wet for this, so getting it to the right moisture level is hard. You know, you let it dry, and you start when you think it's about right. That's basically all you can do. But if you have a tester piece, that'll allow you to figure it out. So you can go back over it just as much as you want. Some people don't like doing that, but I don't see a problem with it as long as the end result is what you want. And then you have a bevel. So here, I pressed down really hard when I did the cut for this. So let's get up close here, take a good look. So here's the bevel now. Because I pressed down really hard, you can kind of see a white line in there. That's because of how deep I cut. Because of the depth of the cut, it gave me that little white line. If you want to avoid that, you just don't cut as deep. And as you can see on the bevel, I've extruded this line out, and I'm trying to get the glare right. But there are basically, you can't see any tool marks. Because the moisture content was decent enough with the quick case, it also darkened the line a bit, which is good. That's usually what you want. You want a little bit of darkness there, because that really, it kind of like does background shading for you as part of the bevel. So now that we've beveled this line, let's say you did have some tool marks in there. What can you do to avoid that? So let's go ahead and just get an example of what a tool mark would look like. Okay, so there I made a really hard hit tool mark there, and you can actually see where it even did more of the leather. So what can you do with that? Well, what you can do is you can take your tool and just press down around it to smooth it out. What you're doing, essentially, all tooling is sculpting the leather. You're sculpting it. So one of your tools can be to sculpt that leather hit. The other thing you can do, so now that I've sculpted that out, there's no tool mark, and when I hit the glare, I don't see the edges of the tool, but it is deeper there. So what you want to do next is hit the tool around the area to try to get about the same depth without hitting it too hard to create a tool mark. So you can even it out that way as well. So here I have a shader beveler. This one is matted on one side. The nice part about these is it hides your tool marks. So if you're struggling with a beveler to make bevels without that are showing your tool marks, if you're trying to avoid that and you're having a really hard time, pick up one of these, and not only do you get a nice shading, but it hides your tool marks pretty well. You can still get them though, so I would still watch out for them. The disadvantage is the smoothing technique afterwards you can't really do with these. So let's go ahead and try one of this one out. Same deal for using it. You seat it in the cut, just seat it in there. I keep my bevel straight up and down. For the most part, you don't want to angle your beveler. And then go ahead and start beveling. Same thing, taps. You don't want to hit too hard. It's basically the same. And you go up and down that line. I tend to go back and forth on the line. I'm kind of a cautious beveler when it comes to that. I like to go up and down the thing until I get it perfectly what I want. So, but here's the result. You have a nice shaded line. You can tell that the leather here was cased because of how dark it is there. There is no like white line on this one because I didn't cut that deep as the other one. And I don't know if I can get a glare here, but when you look at it with the glare, there are no tool marks. That's basically it for that kind of shading, and you can get a nice sort of matte finish. But I have seen when people use this incorrectly, if they hit too hard, or they're hitting hard and not letting it ride down. So you want to hit it, tap, 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 let it ride down. And then I like to go back and forth if I didn't get a really good tip. When I go back and forth, it's really, I'm adjusting the depth, really. But it also helps with that pattern. It helps smooth out the pattern, and it helps hide your individual hits so that you don't see the individual tool marks. But you can overhit these and get tool marks. So while it is easier to hide tool marks with this, it's still possible to get them. So I advise caution there. So that's your basic beveling. You have other bevelers depending on the job. There are lots of different tools. I've got a bunch out here, but there's so many options because you're sculpting and it's an art form. There are many, many different options for bevelers. This one's a lot steeper to allow you to get into spots. This is what is called an undercut beveler, and this is actually meant to go under the cut and lift it. It's a bit harder to use this, but there are different versions of it, different angles, steepness of it. Other things you can do to help smooth out your bevels if you need to is you can get modeling tools and modeling spoons that allow you to smooth out that leather a little bit more if you need to. And what you would do with this is sort of take this to your bevel, seat it in there, and roll it across. Of course, there needs to be a little bit of moisture in there when you do that. And I would also advise caution, because if there are any grooves in your spoon, that'll show up out here. The other thing you can do, if your knife is pulling the leather, like mine is not, mine is a good nice cut here, but if it's pulling the leather, you can smooth it out with a modeling tool on that cut as well. So that's it for basic beveling. You can use that that technique. So we're going to go over a little bit on the curves here to show what changes with a curve. Okay, so when you're beveling on a curve, you want your tool to follow that curve around as you tap. And so before you actually start beveling, you might want to just grab your tool, put it in, seat it in the cut, and then sort of see how your hand is going to move. If you don't have a lot of hand dexterity or you're still training it, I think this is a good way to say, okay, this is what I want to do. The other thing you need to do is make sure you look at your design from afar. So step back, look at it, and make sure that you're beveling on the correct side. I've seen people bevel things and they accidentally bevel it on the wrong side. They'll bevel it over here, and they get the inverse effect. It's not, you're making the part that's not supposed to be 3D, or it's supposed to be 3D, not 3D. So be really very careful of that, to take a step back and say, okay, this outside edge that's the edge that I need to bevel. Sometimes there are patterns where that edge flips, so maybe it'll come around the curve and then it'll stop here, and now this edge is supposed to be the outside. So you need to plan that ahead of time, because once you make that tool mark, you can't go back. So with a curved bevel, it's the same thing. Get your hand in position. I am left-handed. This is the hand that I do swivel knife cuts with, so I'm used to swiveling a tool around. I recommend using your dominant hand for the hand that holds the tool, but to each their own. So whatever works best for you is what is best. But yeah, same thing here. Seat it, start tapping. Let the taps guide it as you loosely hold it. You don't want to have a death grip on it. Just go around the curve. Do your beveling, and go back and forth as you need. Be careful though, if you are going back and forth like I am, be careful to not hit it too hard on your way back. You don't want to create another tool mark. I like to go back and forth I think for the most part, most leather workers recommend you just go one direction the whole time. And I think that's fine too. I think whatever tooling technique, everyone has their own tooling technique, and there are some best practices, but there's a lot of wiggle room for whatever works for you. Okay, so there you go. Just pull up that edge there. The nice part about this example here is you can see it really pulled out this cut. It made it look very 3D, and that's what you're going for. You're trying to make it stand out. Best practices and tips. I think my first tip here that I want to highlight is if you have arthritic hands, or if you have hands that get sore after doing lots of tool work, I recommend these. These are basically the pencil holder things you can get for pencils, but you can attach them to your tools, and it'll let your hand guide it still. It's a little bit harder with beveling tools to use correctly because it's going to be constantly moving on you a little bit, but it is something. If you can't do this without pain, this helps with that. I typically use these for stamping, so I got like a stamp here, and I put them on my stamps, and because I'll be stamping for hours, and over time that will destroy your hands, so I like to use it for that. So that's my first tip. Let's go into best practices though. So here I have this book. I can't recommend this book more. This is an awesome book. It's Tech Tips by Al Stallman, and it goes through cutting tips, beveling, and then shading and adding detail. So for us, we care most about, right, for this tutorial, the actual beveling tips here. As they say here, you have your right and your wrong. So on your wrong example here, they're just highlighting that you can see every tool mark, and it's very choppy and just not smooth. The other part of it, you can see they let the tool bounce a little bit too much, and it came over the line and bit into that line. And so that's the important part about seating your tool to start. You want to make sure it's nice and seated well so that you don't do that. So over here we have the right example. You can see we haven't ate the line up at all, and it's nice and beveled, and there's no tool marks there. So that's what you want to go for. So over here is an example of the wrong side. They tooled this side of it when they should have tooled the other side of it, because this is the part that's closer to the eye. This part is supposed to be sticking out. So if you tool on this side, you're actually inversing the direction that pedal would be flowing. So that's something to watch out for. But yeah, this book, it shows as much as it tells. It has plenty of examples of what to do and versus what not to do for best practices. It's obviously not 100% a rule because this is art. Sometimes you want a choppy look. So over here we have backgrounding, and with the backgrounding here, that it's super choppy, and I've seen this a lot as well when I'm looking at different pieces. But what you really want is this nice smooth backgrounding. Maybe you want choppy if you're trying to illustrate some sort of chaos. So if you're doing some sort of chaotic scene, something where you really want to show churn for that backgrounding, you might have that more choppy. But in general, you want it nice and smooth. One last thing I wanted to highlight here, this has to do with your swivel knife technique. And a good cut helps your bevels come out better, but something to remember when you are cutting is not to cut at an angle, and to make sure that you don't overcut. So over here is an example of an overcut where you cut too far and you start crossing lines. So over here an overcut, and that'll show up in your bevel too, because you're going to try to get your tool over there. When you overcut though, there's really not much you can do about it. You can take a modeling spoon to an overcut and you can sort of smooth it over, but there will still be a tiny line there, so something that you can't really correct if that happens. So I would just watch out for those overcuts. I see that a lot on curves. Someone will come in with a curve and they will just curve into an overcut. So like kind of over here, they've curved into an overcut here. Something to be careful about. Something else that they are highlighting, so when you have a lot of swirls, people tend to tilt their swivel knife into those cuts. You want to keep it up and as straight as you can, or else you can get some undercutting, and when you get undercutting, you're not going to be very successful with your beveling afterwards. So that can set you up for failure with those undercuts. Something to be careful of. Okay, that's it for the tutorial. I hope you learned something. Once again, I'm Zalos. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your future projects.